Consumers plan to save their Stage 3 tax cuts, which could help keep inflation lower. Telstra to axe almost 10% of its workforce, and the ACCC forecasts that domestic airfares could fall. Welcome to Fear and Greed Daily Business News for people who make their own decisions. It is Wednesday, the 22nd of May, 2024. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, after the show, you have an interview coming up with Ingrid Kukuljan, who is the Head of Impact and Sustainable Investing at Federated Hermes.
All about biodiversity. Now, biodiversity is kind of, well, by my reckoning, it's where ESG was 10 years ago. It's kind of at its beginnings in terms of coming to the attention of mainstream investors. A bunch of investors have known about it for a long time, but it is becoming much more relevant, and we're going to hear a lot more about it from an investing point of view. So we talked to Ingrid all about that. She spoke to us from London. She's been out here, and she doesn't pull her punches about what she thinks about Australia and our lack of action on addressing biodiversity challenges. Would you say, Michael?
That is absolutely right. She is very forthright about it, which is actually really refreshing to hear.
That's great.
Kind of the challenges put out there, and it's definitely worth a listen. It's coming up a little bit later on. Also, Sean, there is still time to head along to fearandgreed.com.au and sign up for the weekly newsletter, which comes out every Wednesday mid-morning, so it is not too late, unless, of course, you're listening to this in the evening, in which case get on now and sign up for next week's. But that's at fearandgreed.com.au. The main story this morning, Sean, the Reserve Bank seriously debated lifting the official interest rate at its board meeting 2 weeks ago and remains very alert to stubbornly high inflation.
The minutes of the Reserve Bank's board meeting show that any further slippage in the bank's current forecast for inflation to hit 2.6% by mid-2026 could trigger another rate hike. The meeting was held after March quarter CPI data, which was higher than forecast. However, the central bank also said it didn't want to use monetary policy, which is a very blunt economic policy instrument because it hits everyone. They don't want to use monetary policy to excessively fine-tune the economy. Since then, the federal budget has been released, and a $300 energy rebate should push inflation lower towards the end of this year. Also, the Westpac Consumer Sentiment Survey released yesterday shows that people are looking to use their Stage 3 tax cuts to pay down debt or save rather than rush out and spend it. Westpac estimates that 30% will save all the tax cut, while 50% will save at least half. That would help the Reserve Bank's efforts to keep a lid on inflation. Overall, the Westpac Consumer Sentiment Index fell by 0.3% during this month. Westpac said the survey highlights that there is no let-up in the weak consumer environment and the cautious mindset of consumers. The May survey, conducted during budget week, provides a comparison of sentiment before and after the budget announcement. Sentiment before the budget was much more optimistic than afterwards.
Sean, just explain this for me for a second. If 80% of people save at least some of their Stage 3 tax cuts, does that mean then the Reserve Bank might have overestimated the impact on prices?
Possibly. Depends on what measures the central bank used to forecast people's propensity to save. In the minutes of the board meeting yesterday, the bank did say households were maintaining a higher rate of savings than expected. But the Westpac figure of 80% definitely seems like a big chunk of people being, shall we say, prudent, not spending their money. If that is the case, it is quite possible that the tax cuts won't cause as many price rises as expected. Now, remember, the Reserve Bank, Treasury, all those guys, they're forecast that inflation won't return to target until the second half of next year on the basis of people spending their tax cuts. So if they don't spend their tax cuts, as the Westpac data suggests, well, maybe inflation won't quite be as bad as we thought. And that would be good news for those wanting interest rates to fall.
All right, let's have a look at local markets. What happened yesterday?
Plenty, Michael, plenty. The S&P ASX 200 closed down slightly to 7,852 points, but that means it held on to most of Monday's gains and remains close to a record level. Among the large caps, the banks were mixed, as were the big miners and retailers. Energy groups Woodside and Santos were lower, as was property leader Goodman Group. WiseTech Global was among the better performers. A lot of corporate news around yesterday. Let's run through some of the key points. Lab testing company ALS rallied 5%, the best of the top 200, after a net profit tumble was in line with expectations. That's when bad news is good news, because it's exactly what investors thought. Now, ALS had previously come out and said that it had to write down a purchase of a European drug testing business. Anyway, the bad news was good news yesterday in that instance. Software group Technology One jumped 4.6%, one of its best days in 4 years, after announcing a 16% rise in profit for the 6 months to the end of March. Basically, it makes cloud-based enterprise resource planning software. During the half, signed up a bunch of new customers. Good news for Tech One. Diagnostics group Sonic Healthcare said profits will be lower than forecast this financial year due to inflation and currency headwinds. That sent its share price down about 6%. Producer Illumina jumped 2% after some of the details around its acquisition offer by US partner Alcoa were worked out. And casino operator Sky City rallied 2.6% on news it has reached an agreement with New Zealand's government about its non-compliance with anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing laws.
Sean, just while we're on local markets, can I give a quick little plug to today's episode of How Do They Afford That? It comes out every Wednesday, of course. And I know I'm doing this well out of order. Normally I do this at the end of the show, but I just want to mention this one because it is probably almost my favorite episode of How Do They Afford That, which is usually all about kind of personal finance and investing. And today we have an interview actually with a great supporter of the podcast, Roger Montgomery, is on this episode of How Do They Afford That in the studio with me and Canna Campbell. And he gives us basically the ultimate guide to his investing principles. And so he takes us through in some detail what he actually looks for in quality companies, the whole mindset. He gives us a bunch of examples of companies that he likes and doesn't like and why, and just explains it all. So it is a fantastic interview for experienced investors, for anyone interested in kind of getting started, for anyone who just wants to kind of brush up on a bit of knowledge. It is a fantastic episode. And I know I'm biased because I'm involved in it, but so I should acknowledge that. But it's How Do They Afford That is the podcast. It is our sister podcast, all about personal finance and investing. And I'll put a link in today's show notes, and you can find it wherever you listen to podcasts as well. I'm hoping we can count on you to listen, Sean.
I'll be listening. Absolutely. I'll be there before anyone else.
Well, thank you. International markets back on track now, just seamlessly back on track. What's happening in international markets?
Oil and gold prices have both come off a bit. Iron ore's down just a touch following its rise late last week. The Aussie dollar's fetching 66.5 US cents. But really, most of the action in international markets have been in cryptocurrencies. Been a couple of really good sessions, particularly for number 2 unit Ethereum. It's up nearly 20% amid speculation that the US securities regulator may approve an Ethereum-based exchange-traded fund. Bitcoin has also risen. It's around 71,000 US dollars a unit, close to its record high of 73,000 US dollars a unit. Michael?
All right, bit to get through. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, Telstra will cut about 10% of its workforce, 2,800 jobs, in an effort to save $350 million as it struggles to compete with new technologies.
It's part of Telstra's long-term plan to become more efficient and reflects the fact that people are shifting from traditional voice calls, particularly on landlines, to cheaper internet-based services provided by software companies. Chief Executive Vicky Brady said Telstra's working through an evolving competitive landscape, rapid advances in technology, changing customer needs and ongoing inflationary pressures. Telstra will also stop its practice of linking price rises on monthly mobile plans to inflation. That kind of gives it more leeway to adjust prices at different times. Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers weighed into the debate, saying the cuts will face scrutiny, while the Communications Workers Union called the job cuts absolutely appalling. Now, the announcement isn't totally surprising. Telstra's enterprise division, which provides fixed infrastructure for businesses, was already under review, and given how many companies are moving to the cloud, it isn't a surprise jobs are going in that part of the business. The consumer business has been impacted by the NBN rollout. The shift to remote work has culled demand for handsets on the office desk, for example. Like, who has an office phone now? Don't know. Interestingly, Vicky Brady even admitted yesterday she doesn't have a landline. She doesn't have a phone on her desk. So it's not really surprising, some of these changes. Telstra's share price closed down nearly 3% yesterday.
Uh, Another big story in the last 24 hours, Sean, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese under fire about his response to the International Criminal Court issuing arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas leaders.
Mr. Albanese was keen to deflect questions about the announcement, unlike US President Joe Biden, who called the decision outrageous. The local Prime Minister said he doesn't comment on court processes in Australia, let alone globally, to which Australia is not a party. Now, the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, blasted the Prime Minister, saying he had squibbed it and sold out Australia. Well, a little bit more on that story later in the show. Mr. Albanese yesterday also reiterated his support for Julian Assange in the wake of his extradition appeal win in the British High Court on Monday. Mr. Albanese said his position hasn't changed and there is nothing served by the ongoing incarceration of Mr. Assange. Now, after that High Court decision, Mr. Assange can now appeal his extradition to the US. And just before we leave politics, Australian tourists will be able to start leaving New Caledonia after being given the green light by French authorities.
There was plenty of confusion yesterday around whether Star Entertainment did or did not receive an offer from Hard Rock Hotels and Resorts, with the US-based organisation saying they weren't actually aware of any discussions.
Yes, it sounds like a case of mistaken identity or over-enthusiastic reporters, or maybe Star didn't mind being associated with a Hard Rock name. Overnight on Monday, Hard Rock International denied it was linked to any proposal for Star Entertainment and said it had not licensed its name to any proposal and would consider taking legal action against anyone using it in talks with Star. The US group said they were investigating the matter. Then, yesterday morning, Star told the ASX that, and I quote, "The company has received inbound interest from a number of external parties regarding potential transactions, including an incomplete and indicative proposal from a consortium of investors which included the entity Hard Rock Hotels and Resorts Pacific," which is slightly different to Hard Rock International. All that confusion yesterday sent Star's share price down a touch. And I'm still not sure who's right and who's wrong, but I suspect there's been some confusion over the names.
I'm still confused now. That's all quite extraordinary, isn't it?
So what happened? The Financial Review reported that Hard Rock was interested, was part of a consortium and interested. And I think everyone jumped to the conclusion that we were talking about the famous Hard Rock, as in, and its full name is Hard Rock International. And what the ASX announcement from the Star yesterday said, that there was an entity called Hard Rock Hotels and Resorts Pacific. Now, the odd thing about that is Hard Rock International, though, is very, very careful of anyone using its name. So to assume that Hard Rock Hotels and Resorts is a subsidiary of Hard Rock International or Hard Rocks International is probably a fair assumption, but just maybe it's not.
It keeps on giving, doesn't it, Sean? This one just keeps on going.
Keeps on giving.
James Hardie's share price tumbled 15% yesterday, the biggest one-day drop in more than a year after it downgraded its profit forecast.
High house prices in Australia is curbing demand for the group's products. Volumes in Australia are expected to fall about 5%, but Chief Executive Aaron Erter said it's not just isolated to Australia. There are challenges across Hardie's global operations. Now, the group, which sells wall cladding and plasterboard products, makes about 70% of its profit in North America. With the timing of interest rate cuts in the US being pushed out, earnings will suffer. James Hardie was almost bulletproof to higher interest rates last year because of its position in the US housing sector. However, this year, with rates stable, its share price has actually trended down. Then the big slump yesterday, about $3 billion of its market capitalisation was wiped off yesterday.
And Sean, it's official, at least in the ACCC's eyes, Australia's domestic aviation sector has recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Travel was among the hardest hit by the pandemic. We know that, and airlines in particular, since they couldn't fly people around. The competition watchdog's latest report on the airline industry released yesterday says the major airlines, Jetstar, Qantas, Rex, Virgin Australia, and it included Bonza, carried 4.9 million domestic passengers in March, which is 98.8% of the March 2019 figure. It means that we're back to normal. Airfares have fallen, and the ACCC says it hopes that a more stable sector means ongoing lower fares, and in fact it suggests that airfares might even have further to fall. Good news. Now, a little caveat to this story. So we're talking about March numbers. In actual fact, the February 2024 number was higher than the February 2019 number, but it was a bit of a one-off. One of the factors was Taylor Swift concerts. Fair enough. The other factor, which the ACCC mentions, was a World Wrestling Entertainment event in Perth. Who would have thought that would attract such a huge crowd?
Enough to skew the numbers.
Yeah.
Wow.
WWE. There you go.
I didn't even realise it was on. Then again, I'm not exactly a WWE fanatic. But isn't it funny that we're talking about the pandemic and the recovery of the aviation sector? During the time since the pandemic, there's even been a full airline rise and fall during that time. It's just, isn't that extraordinary in terms of Bonza, as you mentioned?
It is extraordinary.
Now, Sean, turning to international news, we mentioned this one earlier in the show. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants against senior Israeli and Hamas officials, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, over the conduct of the war in Gaza.
The move marks a dramatic escalation of the legal fallout from the war and comes as Israel is under intense international pressure over its 7-month assault, which has killed 35,000 people, according to Palestinian officials, and left the enclave in a humanitarian crisis. The Financial Times is reporting that the ICC said it had reasonable grounds to believe that Israeli and Hamas officials bore criminal responsibility, that phrase is important, for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. In the case of the Hamas leaders, the ICC alleged they had responsibility for crimes of extermination and murder, hostage-taking, rape, and other acts of sexual violence and torture committed by Hamas. In the case of the Israeli officials, including Mr. Netanyahu, the ICC cited alleged responsibility for using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare after Israel imposed a siege on Gaza in the early days of the war.
Finally, Sean, Iran will hold presidential elections on June 28, the semi-official Tasnim news agency reported, following the death of Ebrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash over the weekend.
The Vice President, Mohammad Mokbar, will take on the role of president. In the meantime, Mr. Raisi and 8 others were killed in northwestern Iran after their helicopter went down in a mountainous area. The government blamed bad weather and dense fog. Many Iranian analysts have said it's likely the clerical establishment and supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, will want a president similar to Raisi, an ultra-conservative cleric deeply distrusting of the US and Israel. In recent elections, the Guardian's council actually made it difficult for reformers to stand. So people expect that we'll see another version of Mr. Raisi in Iran.
All right, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. You're talking today to Ingrid Kukuljan, Head of Impact and Sustainable Investing at Federated Hermes.
All about biodiversity and the role biodiversity will play in investing in the future. It's a fascinating chat.
Yeah, it sure is. It's coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au, where you can sign up for our weekly newsletter out every Wednesday. So do it now. And don't forget to check out that episode of How Do They Afford That, our weekly sister podcast all about personal finance and investing, making your money work harder for you. Special episode today featuring Roger Montgomery in the studio, sharing all of his tips and wisdom. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Wednesday, the 22nd of May, 2024. Make sure you're following the podcast and please join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, TikTok and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.